Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfurth, and Redbridge's Kos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. Good morning, Curtinistas. Welcome back to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast of politics, culture and ideas. I'm Nick Dyrenfurth, your co-host, and I'm joined by my great mate, Kung Fu Kos Samaras, Director of Redbridge and JCRC Board Member. Good morning, Cosmos.
Good morning.
How are you?
Good, mate.
Mate, I think half the political class are probably picking themselves up off the ground, having read that Resolve poll, which appeared in the 9 media papers. Pretty stunning numbers. The lowest coalition primary recorded in Resolve polling history. Admittedly, that's not a long data set. And One Nation surging. And also the other data point, which is setting off alarm bells, is respondents were asked, would they be more likely or less likely to vote for One Nation if Barnaby Joyce jumped ships? He's already skedoodled from the Nationals Party. That was a long time coming. And it looks pretty inevitable that he will join One Nation, an attempt to enter the Senate there in New South Wales. What do you make of the Resolve polling? And it seems to confirm a longer-term trend.
Yeah, it's in line with what we've picked up. It's in line with Newspolls numbers. It's fairly consistent, and that is a collapse of the coalition vote, and the majority of that collapse is the result of One Nation pillaging their support base. I think as we've touched on previous episodes, the people that are voting for them, usually that have moved from the Liberal Party to One Nation, work with their hands. They're in their 50s. They're largely Gen X men. 1 in 4 Gen X men that are actually planning to vote One Nation right now. And that is a number that we published in the Financial Review last week. So everything's consistent. The data point from Resolve that I think is the most profound is the 39% of Liberal Party or coalition voters who planned to vote for One Nation if Barnaby Joyce is running them. And that doesn't surprise me, because when we speak to these types of Australians, these are Australians that generally, again, as I've touched on, don't have a university degree, are feeling financial pressure. They're largely in their 50s. They live in the regions and outer suburban peri-urban areas of our country. They've got a long history of voting Liberal, even though their parents may have voted Labor. These individuals tell us that when we will speak to them about One Nation, they would say that Pauline Hanson's a bit of a joke, that it's not serious, it's not a serious alternative. They were looking for a serious leader, and what this will present them is that. And we could see that writ large in the data that Resolve published this morning on the Fairfax papers. 9
media, Fairfax, they'd be very insulted with the Fairfax job that they're out of business. I'm surprised in one way and not in another, cause I've been arguing for a long time and in public that Pauline Hanson is a ceiling on the One Nation vote. She had to go. You know, she's nearly 70. She's part of this, you know, she can no longer pretend to be this outsider insurgent force raging against the Canberra bubble, the Canberra elite establishment. She's part of the furniture in Canberra. And also she carries a lot of historical baggage. People haven't forgotten what she said about Asian immigration to this country in the 1990s, what she said about Indigenous people, and what she alleged was their rorting of welfare and claiming of unfair benefits. What I am surprised about is the Barnaby Joyce angle. My gut feeling, and there's a lot of water to come under the bridge here, Cosy. My gut feeling was that Barnaby might provide a sort of short-term sugar hit, But going forward, they actually need to jump several generations. And this is something we've been banging the drum about on the pod all year. Look at Europe. Look at the parties that the sort of these far right, alt right, populist right parties are putting up. They're putting up younger leaders who aren't so animated by issues of race and ethnicity, and who actually look like, you know, modern Denmark or modern Austria. The list goes on. So I'll be interested to see if that one-off question about Barnaby Joyce actually holds, if he jumps ship and then, because there's a lot of water to come under the bridge before the 2028 general election.
Yeah, but it will, because young people in this country, to the tune of about 70%, two-party preferred, voting for the parties of the left. You cannot convince progressives to suddenly be a right-winger.
Yeah.
Just not going to happen. Political psychology just tells you that, right?
Yeah.
Young people in this country are very different to young people in the UK. There is a ton of data, both in this country and internationally, to show us that separation. And anyone who thinks that you can convince a progressive to suddenly vote for a right-wing nationalist, good luck with that, because that's just not going to happen. What is happening here? There's
probably more chance of you going to church this Sunday, Cosy.
Absolutely. More chance for me to someone become religious and think there's an afterlife, of course, right? What is going on here is the 50-something-year-olds and the 60-something-year-olds that are historically back to the Liberal Party are moving to One Nation. So Barnaby is actually quite a good fit for them at the moment, right? But to a certain point, you are correct. There is limited growth here because of that demographic wall. So this will, in the short term, create massive problems for the coalition on its right flank. It will create massive problems at the 2028 federal election, no doubt about it now. It will cause them problems in state elections, and we could touch on that.
Certainly we'll go there shortly.
And so I think that Barnaby Joyce is a person that, one, hasn't got a long history of, stunts in Parliament. He's on the record and criticising Pauline on some of the race stuff. So again, it doesn't surprise me that number amongst the Liberal Party in Resolve's numbers is quite significant. That is 39% of all coalition voters will contemplate voting for One Nation if Barnaby Joyce is running the show.
Interesting. Just I wanted to come back to one of you mentioned the appeal to non-tertiary educated voters, and I actually think it's worth just pausing and digging into that.
Yep.
It's often reeled off as some kind of minority, but here's a reality check for listeners, political class listeners and journalists who are tuning in. Some of them have been surprised, but I've reminded them of this. Over 70% of Australians don't have a tertiary degree. So they're the majority. So there is scope for growth here. That jumping, Labor, Liberal, One Nation, that realignment, what I call the socio-class educational realignment, which is going on not just in Australia but globally.
Yeah, again, and there's also an age slant to that as well.
Yes.
So if you look at millennial women, there are about 55% who've got a university degree, versus baby boomer women, it's in the teens. So again, there's a massive skew in this. It's driven by older Australians. If we go to the baby boomer generation, the numbers are quite small, and Gen X is a little bit better. It's still in the 30% mark. And really then it starts to change drastically with millennial and Gen Z in terms of university qualifications. It's not unusual to look at any data sample and pretty much identify about 50%, in excess of 50% of Gen Z voters in large cities actually have a university degree. That said, to your point, still it's 45% that don't, right? And so that needs to be watched. And what we know about that 45% is that they're still relatively similar to their voting patterns to their counterparts who do have a university degree, with some caveats. The young men, there is a greater tendency amongst them to be voting for the Liberal Party. Not One Nation, but the Liberal Party. So it's about in the high teens, which is very high for that particular generation, but ain't huge. So we can see that cohort without a university degree does skew conservative. Not massively. It's still, I would say, from a two-party preferred perspective, if we were to talk about young men, 18 to 28 years of age, what is the two-party preferred vote for the Labor Party amongst non-university educated individuals of this particular demographic? It's about 55. It's still winning, but it ain't 70, which is the overall number that we get when we count them all together. So you are correct in saying that there is that realignment, and it is occurring in this country as well.
I was just saying too, Cosy, we don't have time to discuss this. I mean, I'm fascinated by this kind of psephological matters, but there's also a lot of people who've acquired university degrees the last decade or so, and they're now worthless. And AI is going to make them worthless. So I think that's only going to fuel left-right populism. They may be knowledge class people, but they're struggling materially, and they're going to struggle materially because the jobs that they've been trained for, these huge HECS debts that they've accrued, don't have the same value that they did, say, pre-global financial crisis.
We are testing this space actively at the moment.
Excellent.
In terms of what is the political reaction by younger Australians to stress, sense of abandonment, sense that the political class has dropped the ball. And it is, at the moment, a left-wing response. So they are gravitating towards economic populism, or left-wing populism, whatever you want to call that. They blame the economy, and older Australians are switching to right-wing populism. So we're going to see a fragmentation of the political landscape. There's no doubt about that. And what we're seeing at the moment is the story as it's being told on the right side. On the left side, I think the only reason we're not seeing drastic shifts, although there are significant numbers of Gen Z that are voting Green or planning to vote Green, the Greens have not really stumped up that alternative economic narrative to Labor and not really been successful with doing that. They've tried it with Max Chandler-Mather, from the previous term.
Well, he was doing okay up until October 7, because he...
Correct, and then got sucked into that vortex.
There's the template there. The template's working out in the UK with Jack Palahniuk, the eco-populist leader of the Greens in the UK, and they're surging.
They're surging because he talks about the economy,
and he looks like young. He looks like he is a millennial. He looks like
that. And he talks about the economy, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at most young people in the UK right now, they are all doing it pretty tough, unless they obviously belong to fairly wealthy families and a particular class structure, which has enabled them to access the housing market and so on. So, I think we are definitely living in interesting times.
We are. Just to come back to your AFR Redbridge poll, which showed 1 in 4 Australian Gen X men now supporting One Nation. Now, that's men over 50, so you cut me out, the old genennial or whatever.
It's 48 to high 50s.
Okay, so I missed out there. Thank God.
Just
mercies in life.
Just, mate, just. So that's that
you
bracket.
Call them, I love the term. You call them the new political anti-heroes. Explain that term. And are they the kind of people that Andrew Hastie, you say, is going after the boomer class? Is he also going after these anti-heroes? I saw on the weekend he is continuing to push this. He's suggesting he's going to do campaign big on immigration and link to housing. And I know, Andrew, you tune in from time to time and your mates do. But listen, mate, I think you're heading down the wrong path here. And also, punters aren't silly, mate. There certainly was an impact. Immigration did have an impact. I'll tell you what had an impact on. It was wages for a very long time. It was being used as a tool of wage suppression. I didn't hear Andrew and any of the One Nation types talk about the effect on wages and job security. Anyway, that's
an economic point, right? So again, what's missing from the coalition and all leadership aspirants is what is their plan about the economy. If you want to go down the immigration road, sure, drive down that road. But at the end of that road, you're gonna meet a couple of problems and a couple of very big brick walls. The first one is, you get to the end of the road and you discover you can't win seats in our large cities. That's the first barrier, particularly Sydney and Melbourne. And now the cities now determine election results. Not over Queensland. That's the first brick wall you're going to discover. The second one will be those individuals that live in till seats. They're going to punish you severely for this. You're going to entrench definitely an alternative centre-right political movement in this country that is opposed to you. So, sure, drive down that road, knock yourself out, see how this little movie ends. It's not going to end well for them.
Okay, there are several other movies playing out in real time. 2026, next year, Kosy, you just mentioned Queensland, but in 2 other states, South Australia and Victoria, voters go to the polls. Tell us the state of play of polling within those 2 states. South Australia is I think it's pretty easily explained. Looks like King Mally, Peter Malinauskas, might rule for several decades if he wishes. But talk us through the state of polling in those 2 states, federal factors which are playing out, including, of course, One Nation, which we've been discussing at length.
We see that One Nation impact already in some of the analysis that we've put together in South Australia. The Labor primary is in the 40s. It's very comfortably going to win this election. It's now a question of what happens with the Liberal Party primary outside of Adelaide and with regards to One Nation. We know that a significant number of people who have historically voted for the Liberals are actually intending to vote One Nation this time round. There's 2 things that I think are going to happen in that state. Although they have swap leaders, it's like swapping a jockey for a horse that is 12 years old and has run its days, right? It's just not going to run fast, is it? First thing is they're going to get pushed out of Adelaide. I think there is a high probability that they may lose every single seat in Adelaide. And then what One Nation does to them outside of Adelaide. The one thing I would say about them changing leader is at least puts a floor under their collapse. And I think the same will apply here in Victoria, where the appointment of Jess Wilson again puts that floor. At least provides them with an ability to start building a different narrative that is to the one that I would say voters have been accustomed to, which is that sort of right-wing male-dominated narrative that comes out of basically Victoria and South Australia and has been coming out for some time. And clearly those 2 states are not big fans of it.
Yeah, it's interesting though they're switching to millennial or Gen X women, but they look schizophrenic because at the one hand they're signaling to lecture, we get it, we need to move with the times, elect relatively moderate progressive women to the highest leadership positions, but then you've got all this noise about immigration and right-wing culture issues. In South Australia, you've got Senator Alex Antich just running riot.
Yeah, that's right.
He reminds me that these sort of Alex Antich characters, they remind me of the Labor Party in the 50s and 60s, and with the Bill Hartleys of the world, Chamberlains and co, who didn't care about winning elections. They cared about winning the internal fight, and thought that there was this natural super big C Conservative majority in Australia. And it was delusional on account of Labor, certain elements in Labor in the 50s and 60s, who preferred ideological purity over actually winning government, and it looks delusional these days.
Well, very similar to UK Labor before Tony Blair.
Yeah.
Right? And so it took Tony Blair to basically come out and advocate for a totally different trajectory for that political movement, and the rest is history. The problem that the Liberal Party faces in Victoria, for example, is that it is trying to now project a modern narrative, and Jessie's trying to pull that together, and she's got a few people around her that can assist her with that. However, if you look at the polls, Labor's primary vote's largely in the low 30s. The Liberal coalition's primary is in the mid-30s, sometimes a little bit higher, depending on the sample. Of that number, there is a portion of it that are historically individuals who vote for One Nation. And there's your danger. So as the coalition in Victoria tries to pivot to the centre, because it has to win seats in Melbourne, it may animate its right flank and cause itself some problems in those peri-urban electorates that it's targeting. So that's that layer. But it needs an 8% swing in Victoria. To give you some context, Kennett in 1992, in his landslide victory, secured a 5.8% swing. Ted Baillieu, who won in 2010, secured a 5.4% swing. And Brax, in his landslide win of 2002, secured a 7.5% swing. So she has to shoot the lights out completely, have an absolute perler of a campaign and perler of a year to pull this off. They have to win 17 seats, 16, but I expect Paran to be lost back to the Greens at the next election. And in a state where, for example, they have to win 6 of the top 20 most diverse electorates in the state, and they currently hold 0 of those electorates.
Okay. I'm going to put you on the line here, Kosy. Have you got a tip for the outcome for the Victorian state election?
Outcome of the Victorian state election, if you were to put a gun to my head today, I would say Labor win, and it could be a shallow Labor win, or it could be one with a few seats as a buffer. It's going to be messy. We are heading into uncharted territory.
Fragmentation.
Right, fragmentation. So we will get a lot of unprecedented results. And although I've just given you a prediction, I will put a caveat to it. I can still see a day where the Liberal Party wins an election with a 3 in front of its primary vote because of a collapse of the Labor primary. Werribee by-elections are a really good example of that. They lost 16% of their primary vote. Most of it went to minor parties and came back to them in the wash. Well, they can't cop that in every seat. So they can still win those seats because of that fragmentation. It doesn't coalesce around the the Liberal Party. But you play that out in some of the other marginals and you start losing a bag of seats, even though the Liberal Party can basically not even move on its primary vote. So what happened federally can happen in reverse, is my point. I don't think we're there yet, but I wouldn't rule out a future where such results are actually possible for the Liberal Party.
Just coming back to South Australia, because look at the serendipity here, mate. An hour ago, Ashton Hearn confirmed as SA Liberals leader. She got 3 months. 3 months. That is a really narrow window of opportunity. She's a first-term MP. So there's also a counter-argument, Kosy, and Labor's been guilty of this. Labor's put women into the leadership position and they've had to eat a shit sandwich. There's Joan Kerner, there's countless there's many examples of when, and I think maybe the Liberals are doing this with Susan Ley as well. They've been given a poisoned chalice, and this may be a poisoned chalice for Miss Hearn.
Well, her biggest problem is cut through. It's not unusual for us to struggle to get voters to tell us who the leader is in any state, as in the Premier, and this is after a few years. Dan Andrews was an exception to that because he became a national name through the pandemic. But it was not unusual in 2018, for example, when I was still working for that side of politics, that when we were asking voters, who's your Premier, they go, oh, Andrews Daniel, right? So, beyond the Prime Minister of the country, maybe the Treasurer, most Australians wouldn't have a clue. In fact,
the recent in South Australia, most South Australians would know that Peter Malinauskas is the king.
They know who he is. I'm talking about the challenged opposition leader.
He's another outlier, I think, though.
An outlier, that's right, correct. So it will be very difficult for the opposition leader to get that cut through. The media and the political world does overestimate Australians' interest in politics.
Yeah.
Right? And the political activist class also overestimates Australians' interest in politics. So I would say that we will get to that election next year in South Australia, and there'll be weeks to go, and I would say more than half of that state won't even know who the opposition leader is. Many of them will go to the ballot box not knowing. And this is the challenge because she's only got 3 months. She needed a good run-in. If you look at the successful unprecedented results driven by oppositions to win elections, they were long-term operations. Good example, Ted Baillieu, 2006, lost, did it again in 2010. There was 5 years of branding there, right? And that's the problem that I would say that the opposition leaders in South Australia, Victoria, and of course New South Wales now face.
Yeah, there's one outlier that I'm just thinking of now. I think you're right. Most Australians just not tuning into this.
No,
when I was sent the Resolve polling last night, I saw it was at the top of the Age website, probably on the front page of the paper today. 90% of people would have no idea about that result. One outlier, Cozzy, but it might be that it's just this is from another era, and it's like going back to the horse and cart, the horse and buggy. Steve Brack's 1999. He came from nowhere. I reckon. Was it 6 months out from the? Was it 6 or 12 months out that he became leader?
Catch. There's a catch.
And he didn't.
Everyone in the Labor movement will tell you in Victoria the work was already done.
No, that's what I was going to come to. No. I follow Barnaby very closely, mate.
Yes. Yeah.
And the one Victorian Young Labor state conference that I did rock up to when Barnaby was leader, and that put me off of joining the Labor Party for a good 6 months, that experience. As your mates from the left yelled, my mates from the right. I was actually just sort of in the centre there at that point, wondering what these people were talking about. But I remember, but it's instructive because I remember John Brumby's speech to the young comrades, and the message, the work had been done. This is 1990. This is mid-90s, 30 years ago. I remember it. He was talking about the regions and the fact that they've been snubbed and run down by Kennett and Co. They had a really sharp message on service delivery. Kennett was the villain, and the work had been done. So we're totally on board there. But I think that's also. I just wonder whether that's just a bygone era, and it just doesn't apply to politics in 2025.
Yeah, historical analogies.
And the Libs haven't done the work. They haven't done the work.
I like to give some comparisons on for example, would you tell someone in 1999 in the Labor camp they should look back for inspiration to some state election in the 1970s? Of course not, right? The country was drastically different in the 1970s versus the late 90s. The same thing we could easily now say now. I mean, basically, the demographic profile of Victoria and other states as well, and the country in general, when compared to the turn of this century, massive differences.
Yeah, mate, I've made this point about the Hawke Keating governments of the 80s and 90s. I mean, I had my problems with some of the policy directions that they headed into, particularly late Keatingism. But the basic point I make to people, and people get very reactive and emotional, and sort of for a long time didn't understand where I was coming from. But I made the basic analogy. I said, this was the age of Melways and UBDs.
Right.
Okay? And people were still invoking this. It was a good governing model. People are still invoking this in the age of GPS. And it's like, well, you're asking people what in figurative terms, you're asking people to junk the GPS and Google Maps and go and buy a physical copy of the Melways and the UBD. It's nuts.
Yeah. Most Australians living today were born after 1986. I've made that point before, right? So we're dealing with a very significant population that either was not born or was not living in this country.
Yeah. And it shapes a whole raft of that you've been onto this. I lived this experience of my kids. It shapes the way they do politics, social life, even consumer habits. I said to my 14-year-old son, we need to get you a pair of jeans and a collared shirt so you look respectable. I said, mate, we're going out to Southland. He looked at me like I'd sort of arrived from Mars. He said, why would I always sit? My daughter's a bit different. He said, no, the cards is just order online, Dad. I said, but no, I said, it's got to fit. He's obviously Gen Alpha. It's just the mindset's different, and that it might seem a little bit eccentric, that example, but it's just about a radically different mindset. And I think, these late resets, my gut feeling is they're not going to work because the institutional and collective work hasn't been done. And I'm also in Victoria, and I'm interested in your take on this. We're now seeing the actual opening of some of the big build infrastructure, like the Metro Tunnel, etc. And I wonder how that will play out over the course of 12 months. And Labor may effectively run the argument, you might be a bit tired of us, you're a bit grumpy with us, but we get stuff done. We've just opened the Metro Tunnel. We're going to be opening up this other big build infrastructure. We get stuff done.
Yep.
And look at the alternative.
Yeah, Labor's target is a group of people who are actually sitting in the departure lounge in the other pile, like it was for the federal Labor Party leading into that May 3rd election result. And so long gone are the days where there's a bunch of voters that used to vote for Labor are currently sitting on the Liberal Party. They're just not. And again, that's that very tribal element to our political landscape that we see in 2025 that just was not present when baby boomers were the dominant force on the electoral roll. That's, we've talked about this, Nick, before, and that is that, when baby boomers were dominating the electoral roll, the economic consequences of swinging your vote were very small.
Mm.
Yeah, economic prosperity, a generation that really grew up in a fairly prosperous environment. And it was just quite normal for some of them, not all of them, to switch. We're now living in a very partisan, tribal political landscape, and that's pretty hard for them to pull that off. The other point I'd like to make is don't underestimate the impact the federal coalition's behaviour will have on state politics. So in 2017, I think it was 2017, when they dumped Malcolm Turnbull, I was still working for the Labor side of politics. We saw a dramatic
2018.
We saw a dramatic spike in our track leading up to the 2018 state election. So when they dumped Malcolm Turnbull, we saw a very significant rise in our primary vote, and that was dramatic. So whatever their behaviour looks like next year, let's say, Andrew Hastie becomes leader.
That's a good point, Kos. Yeah.
And he doubles down on the immigration narrative. Well, it might work really well in,
that's the point I made earlier about the schizophrenic nature of the modern Liberal Party.
Right. Yeah, right. It might be a fantastic narrative for if you live in the regions and you're 50 years old or 60 years old and you're white. It will be toxic in Melbourne. And that's going to be pretty hard for the Liberal Party in particular to hide from that, and they would put on the spot that, Jess Wilson will be asked questions around, well, what's your views? Now, she will rightly, because she's a moderate and she is very much the future of that show, oppose what is going on federally. But a problem there is, of course, One Nation is going to be standing, and they're going to, and that federal narrative is going to animate that right flank. And we could possibly see some hemorrhaging on their right flank. So they'll go from 36 down to 32. It's game over.
Game over. You called it. You talked about federal implications there. Let's not let Labor off the hook.
No.
At the moment, across the board, you've got 2PP indicative polling showing, Labor 54, 46, 55, 55, 45, and that's just a reflection of the Liberal chaos and disorder. But there are risks ahead for Labor in 2026. I have this gut feeling that we're going to see, and we talked about this with Paul Sakal a few weeks ago, a repetition of, ran a fantastic campaign. The governing lacks, at least optics-wise, a sense of urgency and narrative. Jim Chalmers and others have been trying. But there are big risks, and big risks because we're seeing inflation return. There's obviously talk that interest rates will actually go up. They're not coming down. They're not going to come down the next year. I think, Labor will come under more scrutiny next year, and particularly around issues, they've got big decisions to make about the energy rebates. I'm not a big fan of them policy-wise. I get why they did it politically. my view is all of and it flows through to housing as well with these first homeowners grants.
Yeah.
Once you put in these subsidies, Cozzy, you got it's a hell of a task then to take them away in Australian political culture. Once people feel like something is permanent, once you stump up short-term solutions, they become permanent problems.
So when you look at 2026 and how what are the negatives for Labor, and we were just talking about the Victorian and South Australian state elections. Again, the federal scene can potentially impact them as well. The one, and it goes to your point, if inflation stays high and interest rates go up, the group that I talked about that currently are sitting in the departure lounge in Victoria are going to be almost impossible to bring back over, because they are the group of people in Victoria who are feeling the pinch financially. They don't want to vote for the Liberal Party, but they are sitting in that departure lounge. Now, the federal campaign that Labor ran was able to pitch to them and get them back, but it's going to be almost near impossible to bring these voters back if inflation is high. Now, I don't know what that picture looks like if they're sitting in that other pile and out of pure grievance because their life is just simply one never-ending story of financial hardship. Do they just go, bugger it, I'm going to punish this government and vote Liberal? That's a possibility. So that's what I'll say, that there is this, caveat on the end where this could actually happen. This scenario could be a problem for Labor there. I think it's a bit too early for that to hit the South Australian Labor campaign, because really we won't see the
It's March, yeah.
That's right. It's so close. I think as the world stands today is what it will look like in March, but the world will be drastically different at the end of next year if we've had another long year of inflation and interest rate rises. So that's a huge risk for the Labor camp in Victoria, and that is the economy and the Feds in particular, the Feds being Labor, looked like they're just treading water. So it might work for them in 2028, but it might be very problematic for their cousins in Victoria.
Yeah, and there's a good historical analogy, Cozzy. The 1992 election, which brought Jeff Kennett to power, that wasn't a ringing endorsement of Jeff Kennett,
No.
and they misread, and then they embarked on, wild orgy of privatisations, building Crown Casino, gutting the public sector, which is not what he really. But why he came to power had more to do with what was going on federally and the national economy.
Yeah. And look, we're talking about, obviously...
this is ancient history now.
Yeah, that's right. But we're talking about an era of politics now that we're all entering, which is one that is very unpredictable, uncharted, and completely unpredictable, as I was touched on before. It is going to be interesting for anyone that's interested in politics, researching politics, and more importantly, if you're in the corporate world, buckle in. It's going to be pretty. It's going to be a wild ride.
It's going to be a wild ride. So I'm going to put you on the spot again. Prediction: South Australian election.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not going to ask you who's going to win, despite what Pete Melly and co say, talking about don't take anything for granted. I think we can safely assume the outcome of that election. I would put the caveat there, though, Cozzy. I often, and it's something I struggle with internally with Labor people, I try to get them to think, put themselves in the shoes of other people and think psychologically. This is going to be a constrained Christmas for many Australians, and they may well come back in January. They haven't been able to take the humble family home holiday. They haven't been able to sort of, spend in the way that ordinarily do. They may well come back in a grumpy mood. Your prediction for the not the outcome of the election, how bad will it be for the Libs? Because if I recall correctly, there was a poll about, I think, 6 months ago, not one of yours, but it warned that the Liberals would have one seat in the lower house in Parliament.
They'll probably end up with a handful of seats. What that number?
Will they retain party status?
Yeah, I think they will, and that's what really the new leader is all about, right? Which is to put that floor underneath their collapse. So I think that will be enough to at least, it will be a terrible result for them, but where, the installation of the new leader, or at least now save them some seats, right? So this is really about saving the furniture on a sinking ship. The point you make about that financial stress, that's already in place. One of the biggest criticisms I have about the political class at the moment is they talk about everything but the cost of living crisis that is actually still afflicting people. It's not like May the 3rd happened and suddenly no one cared about cost of living.
Yeah.
Although the conservative forces in this country thought immigration suddenly was an issue. It just wasn't an issue just before the election, but it suddenly became one. And of course, the rest is history in terms of how they inflicted those wounds upon themselves. But
my point is that it's a point I try and press upon people in the psychology of it. That Christmas New Year period,
yes, of course,
works to crystallise those economic anxieties and insecurities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's
psychology.
That was again Christmas of last year.
Yes, which is why I think it's a blessing in disguise they had a May election. I think if there'd been a March election, then
would have been difficult. I mean, it would have given Paul Erickson less of a runway to turn that around. But look, I think that hardship is still there. Who do they blame though, and who do they find as the solution is the critical point here. They might blame the incumbent government, but they may think the other major party is not the solution either. This is fundamentally, I think, where some conservatives make a mistake. When we speak to younger Australians, for example, all the way up to the age of 50, who are the better economic managers? The coalition has lost that prize to younger Australians. Most younger Australians now will tell us it's Labor. And they'll tell us, yep, they're not perfect, they're not doing much, but if you force me to choose between the two on the economy, I'm picking Labor. And that's the biggest drastic change that's occurred in this country, I think, probably in the last 40 years.
Kos Samaras, we've run out of time. Thank you. We're going to talk in depth about Labor, what it stands for, with the brilliant author Sean Kelly next week, who has penned the 100th edition of the Quarterly Essay series. Very much looking forward to that. Thank you, Kos. Thank you, listeners. For now, it's ciao and arrivederci.